I'm Mario Schapiro. I'm Associate Professor and Vice Dean for the Master and PhD course at FGV Law School. Today I have the privilege to have with me and with us my colleague, Professor Matthew Taylor. Professor Matthew Taylor is professor from American University and a very distinguished scholar who studied Brazil or has studied Brazil over the last few decades. So thank you for your presence here, Matthew, and please tell us how is your experience or recent experience in Brazil teaching in the law in FGV Law School in our global law program.
Thank you, Mario. It's wonderful to be here. It's really been wonderful to be here in Sao Paulo this week. We have a great class of a mixture of doctoral students, master's students, students who are in the global law program from abroad, and they're all very interested in the issue of economic development and law and politics in Brazil. So for me, it's been extremely rich.
Wow. Yeah. I know, Matthew, that you wrote a very important book on Brazilian political economy. The book was published by Cambridge Press. Decadent Developmentalism is the name of the book. And the book, I read it with great interest, telling us the mistakes and problems and difficulties and challenges that Brazil has faced over the last decades since the democratization. So please tell us the main takeaways of this book, which is a very important book for our recent history.
Well, thank you, Mario. Decadent developmentalism came out of 3 decades of being very interested in Brazil and studying Brazil and trying to learn from Brazilians like yourself. As you know, you're a big influence in the book. The central idea of decadent developmentalism is that there's a legacy of institutions in the economic policy space in Brazil that are tied back to the developmentalist period of the authoritarian regime. And this was a period, the authoritarian regime, of course, no democracy and limits on human rights and a variety of very negative political outcomes, but that coincided also with the developmental state, which helped Brazil to grow at a rate that was unprecedented for Brazil, but also quite rapid by global standards. Looking at Brazil since 1985, when the transition from the authoritarian regime began, if we look at the period since 1985, we can see that the legacy institutions of the developmental state are still present. And one of the arguments of the book is that those legacy institutions continue to shape the way that economic policy is written today, even though democracy has introduced a number of new constraints on policymaking. So for anybody who knows Brazil, I won't say anything terribly surprising, but the 1988 Constitution really instituted a number of constraints on economic policymaking, including a major shift in fiscal policy, establishing very strong rights for civil servants, a pension system that was extremely difficult to change but extraordinarily generous. So a lot of what we see in economic policy today is dealing either with the legacies of the military's developmentalist institutions or with some of the perhaps overly optimistic promises of the 1988 Constitution. So decadent developmentalism is trying to understand how that's played out over time, and in particular, what are the institutions and how do they work together that determine the success or failure of economic development in Brazil.
I remember reading the book that you use in several parts of the book the word lackluster to describe the Brazilian trajectory of growth, explaining to the readers that Brazil's growth is less than expected. Brazil achieved not good results. So this word lackluster presents this idea of a frustrating kind of economic development. So, in your view, what's the reason for this kind of lackluster growth? What kind of reasons, or what are the main causes for this kind of achievement? If you compare, for instance, Brazilian trajectory with other emerging economies like India, or of course China, or even perhaps Mexico, I think that Brazil has been achieving bad outcomes compared to these other countries. What is the reason for that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I want to hasten to say that I think that Brazilians themselves point to the lackluster performance of democracy and of economic policy under democracy. But before we talk about the lackluster performance, it's important to recognize that there have been enormous gains. Mm-hmm. So, for example, conquering hyperinflation. This was an essential gain that came about through democratic policymaking that was essential to helping Brazil out of a very deep hole. So I don't want to leave the impression that there haven't been successes along the way. On the other hand, if we look at comparative measures of GDP or the size of the economy, the GDP per capita, how much individuals are earning, if we look at levels of savings or investment, these are all very low by comparison to peer countries of Brazil, whether they are other democracies or upper middle income countries or even other Latin American countries. And so there is a question here about why are we getting these lackluster results? The book, I think there are many explanations to that, so I don't want to claim that I have the best or the only explanation. I think we could think about where Brazil is in the world commercial framework, what Brazil exports as opposed to what it produces internally, what it imports, what kind of technology it's involved in, and all the rest. We could also think about the ability of policymakers to actually achieve their first best goals. The book's argument is really that there are complementarities between the political sphere and the economic sphere in Brazil. And this concept of complementarities is not mine. It's there's a large literature in law and development and political science on institutional complementarities and varieties of capitalism. And what this really refers to is the idea that institutions are never sort of imposed in a vacuum. They come into an institutional setting in which they have to fit and they have to work with other institutions. And the upshot of that is there is no, we often think that all you need to have is technical know-how and you could fix a country. Well, obviously, if it were that simple, we would have fixed all countries. The notion of institutional complementarity is that it really points to the fact that it's extremely difficult to create institutions from zero. We have to create them in settings where there are already countervailing pressures. And in the case of Brazil, these institutions and complementary institutions were created in the wake of an extraordinarily influential period of authoritarian rule. And so, as I've already mentioned, there's this legacy of the developmentalist state, which created a number of organizations and agencies that were used for developmental policy: the National Development Bank, the state-owned banks, a variety of state-owned enterprises. And then on top of that, you layer on the institutions of democracy. The institutions, for example, of multiple political parties, a multi-party system that's very vibrant, but that also creates governance issues. How do you govern in a party system like Brazil's, where there are 35 parties at times? How do you bring together large coalitions in a system like that? And what are the impacts of that for economic policymaking? If you are constantly negotiating how to put together a coalition, that's a wonderful democratic exercise. On the other hand, it does have considerable costs in terms of the efficacy and efficiency of policymaking in the economic sphere.
And let me challenge you from one perspective, or just sharing an idea here. Despite the fact that Brazil has become a vibrant democracy, as you describe in the book, you also describe in the book that the most innovative agent in this economic trajectory is the bureaucracy. So my challenge here, or my question here is it a sort of puzzle that in this vibrant democracy, the most innovative agent or the most innovative player is the bureaucracy? Because you describe how important is or has been the bureaucracy in some cases like HIV program or the central bank to combat the high inflation. So how can we put together all this facts? So on one side we have a vibrant democracy, another kind of regime, but at the same time the most important player in designing, in implementing those policies, those successful policies, are the Brazilian bureaucracy, which are by definition non-majoritarian institutions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How can we reconcile these ideas?
It's an excellent question. I will say, I think that it's important to keep in mind that this is a bureaucracy that has deep roots in society. Mm-hmm. And I'm always impressed in speaking with civil servants in Brazil with, one, how deeply embedded they are in, organizations in society more broadly, but then also just the public spiritedness of those civil servants. I do think that there are incentive structures that are created by the way macro political institutions work in Brazil that do offer an awful lot of autonomy to civil servants who want to make change happen. Mm-hmm. So the fact that there are so many political parties, for example, generates a lot of space for the civil service because there are many principles and they are the agents of those principles, but they respond to so many principles that they can, in some ways, construct their own path. Mm-hmm. The other thing to say here is there are, of course, like in any country, there have been public policy initiatives that have been enormously successful, and there have been some that have been less successful. Your question is excellent, though. I think the ones that have proven most successful are either in a space which is highly technocratic, like the central bank, monetary policy making, or in spaces where they have engaged in constant consultation, coalition building, working across agencies within the federal government, sometimes working across the entire federal system, reaching down to states and municipalities. So I do believe that there are spaces where technocracy of an older sort still exists, but for the most part, this is a bureaucracy which has had to learn to operate in a very democratic space, in a very federative system, and engage in enormous amounts of consultation. I'll give you one good example of this, which is a national strategy against money laundering and corruption. And this was created in the early 2000s. One of the reasons to create it was precisely because the agencies themselves were realizing that they had very little conversation amongst themselves, and that this was leading to frictions, it was leading to conflict, it was not leading to the outcomes that they desired. And over the course of the subsequent decade, and it still exists today, but over the course of the first decade in particular, they were very effective at opening a conversation between agencies and then reaching down into the states and the municipalities and bringing them into conversation as well, and then reaching out to the courts and trying to expand the dialogue with the judicial branch. So to me, this is an inherently democratic process. It's one that was led by the bureaucracy, as you point out, but it's one in which civil servants have engaged in a very democratic process that was open to all of the key stakeholders and that was able to achieve some very important incremental reforms on its own.
Yeah, let me delve into this relationship between bureaucracy and democracy, or technocracy and democracy, because we are now witnessing a crisis of democracy across the globe, and there is a literature, basically, I think that is Danny Roderick and others, discussing two main challenges for the current democracies in the world. The one is the illiberal kind of democracy. So the threat that some leaders, autocratic leaders, put to or present to democracy, challenging democracy from the liberal perspective, or like extracting or removing the liberal component of democracy from the constitutional democracies. But another one is which this literature calls liberal autocracies. So the excess of technocracy, the excess of non-majoritarian institutions ahead of the government. So how do you see this deep state or this deep non-majoritarian institutions governing countries? This literature in general speaks about very independent central banks, independent regulatory agencies, or multilateral organizations that are empowered to govern the economy without the sufficient accountability. Is this a problem? Do you think that this is a problem, or is this sort of exaggeration of the literature?
No, I think you're onto something, and I appreciate that you note that it's not a solely Brazilian problem. This is a problem for governments the world over, balancing sort of the need to make policy with the need to be accountable for those policies. It's very easy to make policy if you don't have to respond to anybody, but those policies may not be as effective. They may be efficient, but they are unlikely to be as effective. I think that, Brazil, it's no secret to you, has had issues with maintaining the accountability of public policy making. And so this is always a constant rebalancing of how you want to get the equilibrium, right? That on the one hand, it's very good to be able to get things done, but to do so in a way that is, respectful of probity, that is avoids some of the rent seeking that sometimes occurs or leads to corruption in the worst cases, is very important. And this is a struggle. I think all democracies face this. Certainly Brazil over the last 4 decades has faced this multiple times and multiple ways, whether it's in anti-corruption or in economic policy making or in social policy. And there have been many good successes, and then there have been some less successful moments. So this is there's no good answer to your question except that this is a long-term balancing issue.
So let's go to the other kind of challenge to the current democracies. And you are a very expert in Brazilian history and Brazilian political economy, but also you are an American scholar who, of course, have a deep understanding of your country, of the U.S. And I would like to ask you to share with us your views of the current stage of democracy in both countries. I know that you are working now in the political risk, so your current project is on political risk. So, what kinds of forecasts you can make, or you can present us to the current stage of democracies in both countries?
It's a very difficult time, and we're speaking here 2 days after the U.S. election and the re-election or the second election of Donald Trump as president. I think that this points to, in terms of political risk analysis, thank you, I am working on a project on political risk analysis, and the thing that constantly comes to mind is the extent to which we may be at a moment of a change in the world order. I think it's not too exaggerated to think that the election of Trump and the election of a number of people like Trump in countries like Hungary or elsewhere around the world really cast doubts about the Western-led liberal order, the extent to which the U.S. can continue to rely on some of the alliance organizations that it has relied on for the past 70 years, that it in fact helped to build over the past 70 years. And so, the big question from a political risk perspective that comes to mind, having seen this election, is that it really does represent a choice about the kind of geopolitical place that the United States wants to inhabit. Mm-hmm. And of course, voters weren't necessarily thinking about that when they voted. They were thinking about more mundane, home-focused problems like inflation or the border and immigration. But the impacts of this will be very, very significant, whether it's Ukraine or the Middle East, I dare say, for Latin America. And, going back to your question, though, and thinking about democracy in the two countries, the parallels between Brazil and the United States have been so uncanny in recent years, whether it was January 6th in the United States and then January 8th here in Brazil, or the parallels between the politics of Trump and the politics of Bolsonaro. I think it was very obvious to anybody who was following people like Orban and Trump that there is something going on here that is deeper than any single politician. It's a worldwide right-wing populist movement that learns from itself and learns from the experiences in diverse countries about tactics, but then also about what sort of rhetoric works, what sort of rhetoric has an impact. And it is responding to real events. I mean, it's responding to real concerns that citizens have about safety, security, about effective government, being clean government in some cases, about migratory flows, and about changes in values and particularly cultural values. So, the more that we think about Brazil and the United States in parallel, I think the more we'll be able to learn what is this movement and what are its likely impacts down the road. So you asked for forecasts. I don't know that I want to make forecasts per se, except to say that we are at a moment where I think it's very possible that we have a sea change in the global order that is something that only happens every 50 to 75 years. So this is a really significant moment.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. It was a privilege to have you here with us this week, and thank you for your presence here.
Thank you, Mario. It's been fun.